All right, guys, we're going to be going over notes for respiration. So what I'd like you to do is make sure that you have your notebook open to these notes that you took last week, or I think the week before even, just to go over respiration so that we all have a good understanding of it. So if we were taking notes in class, you would kind of highlight and add as you needed to, and I'd like you to do that now. So respiration, by definition, is when you take oxygen and carbon dioxide between living cells and their environment. So when we talk about respiration, it is breathing, yes, breathing in and out using your lungs, but also that process of cellular respiration that we studied when we looked at plants this year. Humans, other organisms, even plants go through cellular respiration. But we're going to concentrate a little bit more on the breathing side of that when we're studying the lungs here. So when we look at the respiratory system, it's a collection of organs that take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. When we breathe in, though, we're not just breathing in oxygen. We're breathing in all sorts of other things. So our lungs have the job of taking the stuff that we're breathing in and removing the oxygen from them and getting that oxygen into our bloodstream so that all of those cells in our body get oxygen, all of those organs and cells. So it's a big process that we're going to go through here. So this is your basic picture, right? The air moving into your body, and usually we use our nose, right, and our mouth to get the air in. And there's some different parts that we looked a little bit at when we studied the digestive system, but right now I'm talking about the pharynx and the larynx, which the larynx we often call the voice box, right? The trachea, some people call that the windpipe right here. And then when we move into the bronchus, which is this tube or that tube, we call them the bronchi together. And then we have our lungs, right? You might notice that your lung on this side of the body, if it were inside your body, it'd be your left side, is smaller because your heart sits right in there. And they both perform the function of getting the oxygen to the bloodstream. Now, we've mentioned the diaphragm before when we talked about the muscular system. That is a very important muscle that helps us be able to exhale and inhale and helps regulate that. The one thing that's missing in here, which we'll look at in a little bit, is what the lungs look like inside. So here is what the lungs look like inside. So we have the bronchi here, and then I think of this as kind of like an upside down tree. The bronchioles are in here, and these are like the little branches, right, if we break it down. At the end of the branches, we have what are called alveoli that have red blood and blood cells, red blood cells, and veins and arteries and white blood cells and all those things that are in blood in there. But you can see that there's both blue, which stands for deoxygenated, so it doesn't have oxygen on it, and red, which means it has oxygen on it. And that's where we're removing that oxygen and getting it back. So at the same time that your lungs are putting the oxygen onto the blood, the deoxygenated blood that just got to all your body parts is coming back in and getting blood. So it's a constant process that's happening. So you can see here the alveoli are like the air sacs that allow the lung capacity to be kind of what it is. So the trachea, the bronchi, right, and the bronchioles are the little branches in your lungs. So the organs of respiration, if we were to list them, just to go through them, you have the nose that warms and moistens the air, and that's the main passageway typically. Of course, your mouth works too. Then the pharynx is where the mouth passes the air down to the larynx and the esophagus, right? The esophagus is where we have food. And the larynx, or what we call, as I said, the voice box, that's the throat that contains your vocal cords and produces sound. Then we move into the trachea, or the windpipe, that splits into two branches. The bronchi, singular bronchus, right, that connects the lungs with the trachea. So that's like the big branch, right? Then you have the lungs, where the blood gets oxygen, or what we say oxygenated. And then the bronchioles are those small branches. Then the alveoli, I like to think of them as like a bunch of grapes, right? They kind of look like that, but they're air sacs that all the blood gets taken with oxygen, and the carbon dioxide, right, which we're going to breathe out because we don't need, is going to be exchanged here. So remember, the blood is how we get oxygen where it needs to go. So here it talks about O2 being picked up by the blood, and entering the CO2 entering the alveoli. So right away you're getting rid of the carbon dioxide and you're getting the oxygen on the blood. And then the tissues and cells pick up that oxygen from the blood, and it's a constant process that's happening. So while we're putting oxygen on the blood, we're also getting rid of the carbon dioxide. So the diaphragm is that dome-shaped muscle right down here that contracts and expands to help us inhale and exhale. So it's nice to know that that is part, that's earlier on this year we're talking about parts of the body that are in more than one system. Great example here. The diaphragm is considered a muscle, but clearly it helps the respiratory system and it's part of it. So we always talk about disorders, right, of different systems. So we know asthma, some of us have asthma. Emphysema is actually caused by smoking. Lung cancer typically can be most often caused by cancer, but sometimes just being around smoke can cause it. And we have what's called SARS. That's a respiratory syndrome that happens with various things like pollution and all of that. Back to emphysema for a second. If we were to look at those alveoli, those bunches of grapes, what happens with emphysema is the tar from the nicotine and the smoking coats and covers those alveoli so you can't catch your breath. And so a lot of people with emphysema have to be on oxygen tanks because, remember, your lungs are getting the oxygen out of the air that you breathe. It's not pure oxygen. And so what an oxygen tank does is it makes that job a little bit easier because your lungs just can't do their job because they're covered in that tar. So speaking of, you look, these are real lungs. These are fresh, healthy lungs right here. And these are ones that are covered in tar. And this is somebody who has emphysema. That pinker part is where it was connected to the rest of the body, but you can see that's very different. If you were to feel these, which in the past we've been able to talk to some groups that have come in and showed us real lungs. Unfortunately, we can't do that, definitely not this year, but you would feel that these lungs that have the tar and the emphysema would be very tough, and these healthy lungs would be squishy. There would be plenty of airspace there. So very, very different when you're talking about emphysema and tar from people who smoke versus the healthy lungs. Okay, so this was your notes for the respiratory system. You can always rewind and go back and go over things if I went too quickly.